sent another warning to 5.
Okay, we'll just wait a minute while people are admitted into the Zoom room before we get started. Okay, I think I'm going to get started. I know people will continue to join for the next few minutes. So welcome everyone to this Decolonize Palestine teach-in. It's been organized by an ad hoc group of faculty from different universities in Canada. And we're hoping to continue with a few more of these teach-ins, so please stay tuned for that. My name is Brenna Bhandar, and I'm Associate Professor at the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. And I want to begin first by acknowledging the place from where I'm speaking. I am living and working on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And to do this land acknowledgement, it means acknowledging that this land has never been ceded by these First Nations to the colonial state. It also recognizes that First Nations were never conquered in war. And what we're really acknowledging is, a couple hundred years of ongoing colonial land dispossession. And that is, of course, absolutely pertinent to what we will be discussing during this teach-in. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to thank Adalah Iskander and Kylie Broderick from the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies who are hosting this teach-in, as long as we're with our other co-sponsors who are listed on the poster for this event. And I'll just say that the plan for our teach-in is to have a roundtable style of conversation. And we may have questions, time for questions available towards the end. And if you are interested in posing a question in terms of dealing with our current technological setup, you will need to actually send your questions by email. And the email address to send your questions to is the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies. So the email address is ccms@sfu.ca. And I can repeat that at another juncture in our conversation. So with that, I'd like to introduce our very distinguished panel, we have Suhad Bishara. Dr. Bishara, who recently completed her brilliant dissertation and her PhD at King's College, University of London, is the legal director of Adalah, which is the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. We are also joined by Daryl Li, who's an assistant professor in anthropology at the University of Chicago and the author of the book, The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity, amongst many other publications. We also have John Reynolds with us today, who is an associate professor in law at Maynooth University. And John is the author of, amongst other books, Empire, Emergency, and International Law, and has many other publications relating to third world approaches to international law and Palestine. And finally, we are joined by Nimer Sultany, who is reader in public law at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London. And Nimer is author of the book Law and Revolution, Legitimacy and Contestation After the Arab Spring. So I'm very, very pleased that you could all join us today. And I'm going to kick off our conversation with a first question about the land regime and Palestinian dispossession, which are essential to keep in mind during the current moment. So I was wondering if we could start off, Suhad, with you, in trying to explore the background and the history to the current conflict. What are some aspects of the land regime that you would like to tell our viewers about?
Thank you, Brenna, and everyone who organized this webinar and having me here. I will touch very briefly, of course, on the history of land regime, which maintains dispossession, Jewish territoriality, domination, and so on. But the most interesting thing, and I want to start with that, is that since its establishment in 1948, Israeli land regime has succeeded to maintain a Jewish racial territoriality of domination that transcended and transcends so far time, historical events, legal frameworks, and so on. It was and still based on three main pillars. The first is the dispossession of Palestinians. I mean, this took the form of ethnic cleansing during the Nakba events and internally displacing many Palestinian citizens during the military regime imposed on them between 1948 and 1966. Retroactively validating illegal land seizure through Israeli law. Two main laws I want to mention here that were legislated in the early 50s. One was the absentees property law that puts all of the Palestinian refugees' property under Israeli control, full Israeli control. Later, Israel clarified that these became state land, Israeli state land. Now, estimates vary depending on the sources, from like 4 million dunams to 12 million dunams, depends whether you count the Naqab Desert, which is like 60% of the geographic space of Israel. All of these were vested to the custodian for absentees property, a governmental official, and then sold to the government entity called the Development Authority established under law. It's important to note that under this law, both private properties and Islamic Waqf endowments were taken. The current position of Israel that these became fully owned by the State of Israel, and it has the full freedom under Israeli law to deal with them as the public authorities in Israel see fit, of course, undermining the right of return for the Palestinian refugees, restitution, and so on. The second was a land acquisition law enacted in 1953, aiming to confiscate the internally displaced property, people property, and more. Then again sought for the Development Authority under the so-called development and settlement purposes. It is estimated that about 1.5 million dunams were confiscated under these laws. Now, what characterizes these laws? That it's retroactive so-called validation of illegal seizure of land. It's very sweeping, very arbitrary, and it targeted Palestinian land specifically. So this brought to a situation where about 93% of the land in Israel is state or JNF, Jewish National Fund owned. So which brings me to the second pillar, Jewish territorial domination, which means aspiring to have Jewish majority in each and every region and sub-region in Israel. This was controlled through martial law during the military regime, which determined where Jews and where Palestinian citizens could live through martial law restrictions and under the auspices of security. Then this was adopted as a policy by the Israeli Land Administration. It's a governmental entity that administered all the 93% of the land that's under public control. And later on, some laws that I might refer to later. The third is the connection between the Zionist organizations and the state authorities. Zionist organizations started colonizing Palestine long before the establishment of the state, during the British Mandate and before during the Ottomans. And these continue to function in the same manner after the establishment of the State of Israel. Under Israeli law, these function as a semi-governmental entities, taking integral and major part in the settlement policy in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem. And the fourth pillar, as part of the domination, is segregation. In order to maintain Jewish territorial domination, you have to maintain a system of segregation. This is maintained through different administrative mechanisms, laws, administrative frameworks, and so on. So if you go to Israeli Bureau of Statistics, the identification of all local authorities and towns is either Jewish or non-Jewish or Arab, and there are a few mixed cities like Akka, Haifa, Lid, Ramli, but most of the towns, we're talking about hundreds, in Israel are either Jewish or Arab Palestinians. These same 3 or 4 main pillars also characterize Israeli land policy in the West Bank, although we are talking about completely different legal framework, extraterritorial, international law, international humanitarian law, still the same character exists in its policy of settlement and dispossession, displacement of Palestinians for the sake of Jewish territorial domination in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Of course, East Jerusalem is a unique case because of its illegal annexation and imposing Israeli law in there. I think I will end this round here, and maybe further on I will elaborate on some laws and later developments in this regard.
Thank you very much. I know it's a vast question. It's a vast question. So that's a really great start to this part of the conversation. Can I invite Nimer to comment next?
Thank you, Brenna, and for the organizers. So I thought I would start the conversation by contextualizing the recent debates about recent events, with particular focus on the question of the border, because what we heard in the last couple of weeks is that there is a sovereign border that was crossed by Hamas, and that the attack was unprovoked, and then that Israel had the right to self-defense with respect to that kind of action. Now, what that raises from the context is, first of all, the kind of the ongoing denial of the right to self-determination. So according to international legal consensus, Gaza remains occupied and part of the occupied Palestinian territories. So the ICRC, the Red Cross, and more recently, the Independent Commission of Inquiry with respect to the Palestinian territories emphasized again and again that Gaza, despite the so-called disengagement in 2005, remains, as far as international law is concerned, occupied by Israel. So if it's occupied by Israel, there is no sovereign border. You cannot treat Gaza as an external entity that is independent, and therefore the crossing the border in this sense is not an external attack, because Israel is still the party with obligations towards the Palestinian population, including in Gaza. And of course, the siege in the last 16 years, and the fact that Israel recently was able to quickly turn off the electricity and water and all these kind of basic necessities and supplies, shows how much control Israel has over the population of Gaza. So this is all to say that the clashes in the recent couple of weeks occur in the context of the ongoing and the continuing denial of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, including those who live in Gaza. Now, recently, we have seen debates in the international legal community and the human rights community on the question, what is the nature of this occupation? Some have said that it manifests apartheid system, and in any case that it's illegal for a variety of reasons. And the UN General Assembly recently referred the question of the status or the legality of the Israeli occupation to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, given the fact of the basic observation that occupations are supposed to be temporary in their nature, but this occupation obviously have persisted for decades, and in many cases it manifests annexation. So Jerusalem is obviously annexed in a way that is clearly illegal according to international law. And in many kind of interviews that I have seen in the British media, for example, there are Israeli officials from the Jerusalem municipality who are invited to talk about the events without any reference in the media to the fact that Jerusalem is an annexed territory and illegally annexed in the same way that Crimea or other illegally annexed territories are. So there is annexation through law, and there is de facto annexation, as we have seen not only with the fact that there are 700,000 settlers that exist in the West Bank, but also the fact that there has been a transfer under the current government of the responsibility for the settlers who live in the West Bank to civilian authorities, the government, as opposed to the military authorities, which is again kind of a bureaucratic sign of annexation. So we need to think of the West Bank and Gaza as one unit rather than to talk about Gaza as a separate unit. So this is more generally, not only with respect to recent events in the West Bank, the people who were killed in the West Bank, the settlers' activity, and the pogroms against the civilian population in the West Bank. So what we have here is a kind of a vacillation between a colonial status quo in what we can call the normal or the ordinary state of affairs, which manifests apartheid, and then in extraordinary circumstances or moments of heightened crisis, we have colonial wars of pacification or counterinsurgency, whose effect eventually is to maintain the colonial status quo of apartheid. And it's important to mention in this context that self-defense, international law, even if one framed the Israeli actions as self-defense, it cannot be an excuse for annexation, for enforcement of apartheid, for ethnic cleansing, or genocide. The second element, I think, in this context is the ongoing apartheid. So it's amazing that in the current analysis, understanding, and reporting about the events, it's completely forgotten that only a year ago, Amnesty International produced a report saying that Israel is maintaining a system of apartheid from the river to the sea. And a year before that, Human Rights Watch published a similar report, as well as B'Tselem, as well as many Palestinian human rights organizations. And the siege on Gaza, all these organizations have said, is part of this system of domination, is part of this system of apartheid. The fragmentation of the Palestinians into not only West Bank and Gaza, but also within the West Bank into enclaves, and the maintaining racial discrimination of the Palestinians inside Israel, as well as the denial of the refugees' right to return. This fragmentation is part of the system of domination that manifests an apartheid against the Palestinians. And the question of the refugees' return, if we are talking about borders, is also important here because you are familiar with references in the media to Gaza as a prison, a camp of essentially refugees. So these are Palestinian refugees who were ethnically cleansed mostly in 1948. And all these organizations, when they talk about apartheid, if you look at the Convention for the Prohibition of Apartheid, one of the kind of severe violations of human rights or inhuman acts that can be part of the apartheid system is the denial of the right to nationality and the denial of the right to entry to one's land. And we need to recall in this context that the 2018 marches of return in Gaza, which were, a civil form of disobedience or nonviolent demonstrations, were aimed at the right to return, to demanding the right to return, as well as lifting the siege on Gaza. Now, if you permit me one more comment with respect to what Suhad just said. So Suhad mentioned the important figure that with respect to the land regime inside Israel, 93% of the lands are controlled by the Israeli state and quasi-governmental Jewish institutions. And this means that the Palestinian citizens of Israel are excluded from access to these lands. Now, if you compare that to the apartheid regime in South Africa, what you find is that in a way, the Israeli land regime is somewhat worse than the one that historically existed in South Africa. So if you recall, the Native Land Act of 1913 set aside about 7% of the territory for Black Africans, while prohibiting them from acquiring land in the other 93%. And then in 1936, the Native Trust and Land Act increased that to about 13%. So the South African law protected about 13% of the lands as indigenous land, whereas the Israeli legislation excludes the indigenous population from the settlers' land, but does not include the settlers from encroaching upon the remaining 7% of lands in the hand of the Palestinians inside Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think what's often difficult for people to grasp, or people who are not very familiar with the history, is precisely the fragmentation with different legal regimes applying. But if we think about what Suhad told us, that despite all of this legal and spatial fragmentation, the objectives of these different legal regimes are clearly uniform or unified. So with that, Daryl, would you like to come in next?
I thank you so much, Brenna, and everyone else who put this together. And I'm so honored to be in conversation with my comrades, Suhad, Nimer, and John. I think right now I'd just like to make one point, sort of piggybacking on a lot of the things that Suhad said. The regime of Jewish supremacy over land that Suhad described in such penetrating detail, I think it's very important that everyone is clear on what we mean when we talk about the category of Jewishness in this context. The issue here is not merely one of discrimination, where the state, elevates the Jewish parts of the population over the non-Jewish parts of the population, although that would be problematic enough. The issue here is that the entire regime is built around the concept that any person who is defined as a Jew under Israeli law from any part of the world, regardless of whatever personal or family connection they may or may not have to the land, has the right to show up, automatically enjoy citizenship, and automatically enjoy not just equal, but actually superior rights to land and superior social rights to the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, right? Which is to say nothing of Palestinians who have even fewer rights under this regime, those living in the West Bank, those living in Gaza, and those living in exile. So and actually what's really interesting about the law of return, which is the law that kind of enshrines this regime, is that it says that every Jewish person is covered by the law of return, regardless of their place of birth or origin. So indigenous Palestinian Jews and a Jewish person from Russia or the US who shows up today are treated equally as enjoying citizenship by virtue of return under Israeli law, right? So it actually negates the indigeneity of the Jewish communities who lived in Palestine before the Zionist project, right? So this is an extremely sweeping characterization, and it's really key to understanding the very logics of the regime. When the law of return was being debated in the Knesset, the prime minister at the time, David Ben-Gurion, said, this is not an immigration law, right? This is not like, let's give preferential treatment to some people over others. And it's not a law about granting asylum to people who are oppressed. Rather, the law of return expresses what Zionism believes to be a fundamental right of every Jewish person in the world, a right that precedes the state, right? So this colonial logic is, I think, the central, the ideological pillar around which a lot of this stuff revolves. And when, and I think that it's important to be very clear about this when we talk about Israel as a settler colonial project, right? It's not a claim that, it's not about sort of like who was there first or like, oh, are Jewish people native or not? It's about the regime itself and how it understands the nature of the Jewish presence in the country.
Yes, thank you so much for that comment. I think it's really crucial to emphasize that that question of indigeneity needs to be distinguished from Zionism as a modern European settler colonial project. And I think that's also really crucial for people to grasp. So thank you for that. John?
Thanks, Brenna, yeah, and thanks to all the organizers. And I think maybe just before I start, I think it's kind of implicit, and we're all aware of it, but I do just want to just acknowledge like just the context that we're in, the amount of organizing and rapid response work that's been going on over the last couple of weeks. It's been a very tough and traumatic time, I think, for so many people. And so just to see all of these kind of events, all the teach-ins, the webinars, as well as the political interventions and the media work and the public statements and the direct actions and the demonstrations on the streets that everyone's been doing, it's really important and impressive to see all the work that's being done, and obviously particularly for Palestinian colleagues and comrades who are going through so much to still be doing all this work. I think it is important just to acknowledge that, and I think these kind of spaces and conversations are, as well as a place of learning and sharing information, also a place of solidarity. So just to say thanks to you for putting it together and to everyone for being here. So yeah, I think I had kind of similar thoughts to Daryl when I was listening to Suhad and Nimer. I think, you know, this, you know, there's this pattern that happens a lot whenever someone makes a comment about Zionism as colonialism or about Israel as a settler colonial state. You know, there's oftentimes this very defensive reaction on the other side that, you know, Israel could not be colonial. It's an expression of self-determination itself, and it's, you know, on the contrary kind of thing. But, you know, when I think it is, you know, especially when we're talking about this is a decolonizing Palestine event, you know, it is really essential just to be very clear about that, like that, you know, when we look at the land regime and what it is now, we can't understand that without talking about the pre-state period, the early legislation in the 40s and 50s that Suhad talked about, and, you know, the reality that Zionism was and is a process of colonizing and accumulating land. It was built on dispossession. It's, you know, its own proponents were very open about that, and land was, you know, central to it, you know, and the kind of absurd slogan of the land without a people was, you know, was central to that. But the proponents of Zionism themselves, I think, were very clear on the reality that, you know, there was a majority population there that needed to be displaced or removed or dispossessed in whatever variety of ways was most feasible. And there was a whole set of very material institutions that went into that process from the start. So when Herzl talked about, you know, the idea that he had for the chartered company, and he talked about it as being along the lines of the, you know, the great land acquisition companies of the empires, you know, that then evolves into, you know, it doesn't manifest exactly as he envisaged it at first, but evolves, or it comes up in the form of the colonial trust for sourcing the funds. It comes up in the Jewish National Fund that Suhad mentioned in the early 1900s as this territorial fund that's specifically there to redeem or acquire the land for the possession of the Jewish people. And that, you know, that process then, it happens in the early 20th century, and particularly during the Mandate period, is very explicitly for the purpose of settling Jewish people from elsewhere, based on, you know, this idea of land being acquired that will be held in perpetuity for the Jewish people, and ultimately ending up with that 93% that can't be sold or leased to any non-Jews. And you have, you know, that process by the time that the state is created in 1948. The JNF is the largest private landowner in all of the territory, even though by that point the Jewish population is still a minority population in historic Palestine. And so there is, you know, this very material and institutionalized set of processes that happen. And there's, you know, there's the Palestine office of the World Zionist Organization, there's the Anglo-Palestine Bank, there's all of these institutions that are part of it. And we see after the creation of the state, those institutions either continue to function as the kind of parastate Zionist institutions, or they become incorporated into the state apparatus itself, or as private companies. But the Land Development Administration, the JNF, you know, still have a very and the Israel Lands Administration still a very central role in how land is managed. And, you know, the point, and just to, you know, I think it's everyone's probably aware of it, but, you know, the transfer and the displacement of people that happens is, you know, very much part of the story of, you know, of Gaza today, and how the population there are, you know, the majority of them originally refugee and displaced populations, and they're in this enclosed space where the land that they're living on is minimal. And, you know, everyone knows the statistics about the densely populated nature of Gaza, and the suffocation and the repression. But it's, you know, that only happens and can only happen because of the land policies throughout the rest of historic Palestine.
Thank you. I think this sets us up well to shift to something that Nimer already introduced into the conversation, which is the issue of apartheid, So over the last few years, several major human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, including Israeli human rights organizations, B'Tselem, et cetera, have explicitly found in their investigations and their reports, as well as the UN, that Israel is an apartheid state, that it's engaging in apartheid practices, and somehow this fact seems to keep slipping from the public discourse on Israel, particularly in this moment. So I want to invite our panelists to tell us about the legal meaning of apartheid, so what the legal dimension of that is, and the kinds of legal and political mechanisms that have led to this state of apartheid and help maintain its persistence. So Nimer, I'm not sure, maybe you would like to start off, since you've already mentioned it.
Sure. I mean, in terms of international law, when there are severe violations of human rights within an institutionalized system of oppression and domination, that function to maintain this domination of one group over another, then we have a system of apartheid. And there are a litany of legal violations that can constitute this apartheid. Now, we already introduced to the conversation the idea of that Zionism has an intent to dominate, not only to discriminate, as Daryl mentioned. So the main kind of objectives of Zionism in different ways is basically maximizing land control and minimizing demographic Arab and Palestinian presence, while denying the political rights of the native Arab Palestinian population over their own homeland. And this is often described in the Israeli public discourse and even Israeli policies as Judaizing the land, Judaizing the Galilee, Judaizing the Negev, and so on and so forth. So it's not only obviously the West Bank and colonizing the West Bank, but also the intent to Judaize, meaning to achieve Jewish control, Israeli Jewish control over the land, and exclude the Palestinian Arabs who live on the land, even if they were citizens, from that land, as well as maintaining demographic status, Jewish majority status in the land through citizenship and immigration, legislation and regulation, in addition to political domination, which can be achieved, as we said, by fragmenting the Palestinians. So some of them are citizens, some of them are residents in East Jerusalem, some of them are occupied or protected persons according to international law in the West Bank and Gaza, and then some of them are excluded entirely from the geography as refugees. So this intent to dominate applies to Israeli policy toward all Palestinians. Obviously, it's much more brutal when it comes to the military occupation regime within the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza. So in that case, we can see it very starkly in the difference between the status of the settlers in the West Bank. We're talking about 700,000 of them in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the status of the Palestinians who are denied basic rights, including the political rights such as the right to vote. We see it in the separation wall, which was ruled as illegal, and de facto annexation, according to the International Court of Justice in 2014, I believe. There's the different elements of that kind of apartheid regime are manifested in the forcible transfer. One recent example of that is the Masafer Yatta in the West Bank, which was legitimated by the Israeli Supreme Court. There is the ethnic cleansing in the East Jerusalem and the like. But I would like to talk a little bit about the apartheid within Israel, that is, with respect to the Palestinian citizens inside Israel, because this is the disagreement between some of these human rights organizations. So it's important to mention, by the way, that Amnesty said that it's an apartheid from the river to the sea since 1948. So that's an important thing to remember. So it's not kind of a recent arrival. Human Rights Watch differs a little bit, but they also say that there is the basics and were established in 1948 and after. Now, it's usually mentioned, the apartheid regime and description is mentioned with respect to the West Bank, but as Suhad already started describing, it also applies to Israel. Within Israel, also called Israel proper. And the main thing I would like to mention here is three things. One, the absence of formal equality, formal equal protection of the laws does not exist as a explicit constitutional value. In fact, it was deliberately omitted in the discussions in the early 1990s when the so-called Bill of Rights, the two basic laws, were legislated. So it was omitted exactly because of what Daryl was mentioning, which is the Jewishness of the state and the maintaining Jewish supremacy over non-Jews in the country. And the basic law that was legislated recently, 2018, the Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, basically constitutionalized more explicitly the idea of Jewish supremacy and made the development of Jewish settlement, in land and housing, as the kind of constitutional value. So I want you here to imagine what would happen, or if we change the U.S. Constitution to this kind of constitutional system, what would look like? First of all, the U.S. Constitution would call the Union as the white, evangelical, and democratic state. It would also omit the 14th Amendment. There will be no equal protection of the laws, regardless of who you are, in the Constitution. There will be no promise of equality. I'm not talking about substantive and real equality. I'm talking about formal equality. There's no such promise in the Israeli constitutional law in terms of, and it's not for lack of trying. So the Israeli Palestinian lawmakers in the Knesset tried repeatedly to legislate through the Knesset the idea of equality, formal equality, and it was rejected again and again in the last 20 years or so. And then imagine further that this US Constitution would say that the state objective is to ingather the exiles of the white evangelicals over the world and encourage their immigration. And then imagine further that there is an equivalent to the anti-miscegenation laws till the 60s in the US, in the South at least, when you have family unification policies that prevent basically Palestinian citizens of Israel to nationalize their spouses, to be joined by their spouses inside Israel. And then the US Constitution would further say that its objective is to further and consolidate white evangelical settlement. So if you look at it in this way, it becomes clear how the different elements of kind of colonialism and apartheid appear. And maybe Suhad can talk, I guess, on the admission committees law that also are part of this kind of segregation in terms of housing and land allocation.
Sure. Suhad, would you like to?
Yeah. A few short comments, although it's hard to decide where to start. First, I would like to comment that the apartheid analysis in some cases risk lacking analysis of context. So I wanted to put this up front, and I think Nimer wrote also about this. But talking about apartheid characteristics of Israeli policy as part of the wider context of colonial or settler colonial, I think it's a bit more. Let's not lose the context. This is what I'm saying, rather than listing further human rights violations. Okay. I want to start from the end. I've been practicing human rights law for the past like 25 years. And my conclusion with dealing with a lot of dispossession, displacement cases and so on, is that regardless whether you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel under Israeli occupation, West Bank, Jerusalem, or a refugee in any refugee camp, in relation to Israeli policy of territorial racial domination, you're the same. Meaning my citizenship and any framework of constitutional right would not give any advantage in tackling, defending against racial territoriality in Israel, and I will bring a few examples. One of the main characteristics is basically segregation, as I mentioned, and Nimer, and this is during the military regime. They started with the martial law, then administrative decisions of the different governmental entities responsible about the development and managing the 93% of the land, and then later on, after what became to be known as the Constitutional Revolution, we saw that a lot of these policies started to be enshrined in a law. One of these is the Admissions Committee's law that basically says if you want to live in hundreds of towns defined as small towns in the Naqab and the Galilee, you have to pass through admissions committees, regardless now of how the details of how they function. De facto, they function to exclude the Arabs. It's important to know, Palestinians, that since the system exists and existed ever since, it also includes anyone who does not fit what became the minority Jewish group that controls most of the land in Israel. So they exclude a lot of Jews from Mizrahi origin, Arab origin, gay, LGBTQ community in general, people with disabilities, single-parent families, Ethiopians, and whomever they don't want to see as their neighbors. Just to give you a sense, like if we go to the northern district, known as the Galilee, but it's wider than the Galilee, we have 382 towns, including small towns. 80%, 241 of those is Jewish, administered under admissions committees. Now, in the south, we're talking about 89%. In the Naqab, 194 are Jewish, administered under admissions committees, from a total of 255. So we have moved from martial law to administrative decisions to law, like the admissions committees law. And these all function in the West Bank as well, in a way or another under the military rule. And then enshrining that into a constitutional framework, the nation-state law that Nimer mentioned. And Article 7 says in this law that Jewish settlement is one of the basic principles of the state of Israel, and state authorities have the obligation to enhance and expand and so on. And what is interesting about this article, it's a constitutional framework that when we petitioned against the law in general, the nation-state law that enshrines Jewish supremacy in a constitutional framework, the the legal work assumption of the Supreme Court was that Jewish settlement means segregated settlement of Jewish alone, which was a bit weird because you can theoretically say Jewish settlement means the majority of Jewish people in Israel residing in this territory, regardless whether it's defined in a defined border or not. But the working assumption was that no, it is segregated. And then how we work within this framework. So we are seeing a systematic system moving from military to civil administration to law to constitutional framework. And what I'm trying to say is that if we want to fully comprehend what is happening in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, we should look at the history and the current status of Jewish territorial domination in Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinian citizens, because the same is happening over there. And again, I would end up, I mean, Hiram, it's a Palestinian village in the Naqab, in Israel, inhabited by Palestinian Bedouin citizens of Israel. The Supreme Court approved their displacement for the sole purpose to establish a Jewish town on their roads. The same as Masafer Yatta, the same as elsewhere, Jahalin, the same as happened with Iqrat and Bir'an in the 50s, and so on. So regardless, like my citizenship being a protected under occupation or a refugee, this system works with all of its functions, regardless whichever legal system it abides to or does not, regardless. Now, yeah, the sole purpose of this part of all of these legal systems and its functionality under Israeli system is Jewish territorial racial domination. This is how I think we should perceive the system as a whole functioning vis-a-vis historic Palestine, vis-a-vis Palestinian people, regardless which fragment we are talking about.
Thank you so much, Suhad. Daryl and then John, would you, or John?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so okay, so a couple of things I'll say about apartheid. Maybe I think that it was Daryl covered a lot there. I think and Suhad touched on it, but this point about the connection between apartheid and colonialism as the underlying structure, like I think it is really important to emphasize that in many ways apartheid is a kind of a manifestation or a derivative of a settler colonial regime. That's what it was in South Africa, that's what it was in other settler colonies, even if it was in a time before it was called apartheid. And I think that's important. Just it's important because of what Daryl said earlier, just about the nature of how Jewishness is defined in the Israeli kind of political and legal system, that when we talk about apartheid, or we talk about it as colonial apartheid in the sense that it applies in some ways beyond the territory itself. The laws of return, the nationality and immigration laws do have that global reach, essentially, that allow a form of racial domination to extend itself or to exist outside of the territory, in the sense that it can discriminate between someone on the other side of the world and a Palestinian who's in a camp in Lebanon, and those two people are defined entirely differently for the purpose of their relationship with the Israeli state and the land of historic Palestine. And it's important, and I think it's important in and of itself. It's also important thinking about, again, thinking about decolonization or thinking about dismantling apartheid. How do you conceive that in this kind of context? And I think one of the interesting things that a lot of the critical scholarship and activism in South Africa in recent years has been really emphasizing is that transition, the post-apartheid transition in South Africa didn't fully didn't fully incorporate a kind of a decolonization framework into the constitutional transition, and because of that was a partial one at best, and that you know, there are ongoing implications of that, and you know, the South African Communist Party always talked about apartheid as colonialism of a special type. And so, you know, what Shepo Madlingodzi and Joel Madiri and these people who are critiquing now the post-apartheid social reality in South Africa is to say that we kind of, you know, dismantled the formal apartheid legalities, but we didn't address the colonial underpinnings of it. And really, you know, they're talking about land and land redistribution, and they're talking about political economy and the question of resources, and you know, and I think there is, you know, some really urgent kind of conversation that has to be had about, you know, the nature of the complicity of, you know, of the Palestinian Authority with the Israeli apartheid regime, and the, you know, how there's a kind of a layer of a capitalist class there that is incorporated into that to a certain extent, and because it speaks to then the limitations maybe of some of the, as important as they are, the limitations of some of the legal analysis that the human rights organizations have done. And you know, and that is, I think, something that Palestinian activists and Palestinian, or even Palestinian legal organizations have said, is that you know, that there are there's only so much that Human Rights Watch or Amnesty have been able to say about colonialism or settler colonialism or Zionism in our context, and that, you know, to me, that's partly to do with the limitations of international law and the lack of tools it has to deal with that, and the lack of language it has to cover that. And so you have this, you know, analysis based on the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, the Apartheid Convention, and most specifically in those reports, the International Criminal Court statute, which is a criminal law process, and so again can only go so far when we're talking about the structural elements of apartheid, or because the ICC defines apartheid as these acts which are associated with other kind of forms of physical violence and crimes against humanity. And it doesn't really, even if you look at the difference between how apartheid is defined in the the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, versus the 1973 Apartheid Convention, which was also primarily a criminal convention, but has a lot more language in how it defines apartheid in terms of the land and territorial and structural elements of it, and those kind of drop out by the time we get to the 98 and their own statute definition for a variety of reasons to do with, you know, what's happened in the world in the intervening 25 years and neoliberalism, the end of the Cold War, and so on. But the you know, the point, again, going back to the first round, is, you know, the land and territory questions are central to this, and again, thinking about, you know, what apartheid is in terms of grand apartheid, territorial fragmentation. The Bantustan idea from South Africa was something that, you know, Ariel Sharon and other Israeli leaders went to study and to think about how that can be translated in the Palestinian context. And if we think about, you know, for the fragments of the West Bank as Bantustans, or some partial element of the West Bank as a Bantustan, but Al-Mazan in Gaza have talked about Gaza itself as the Gaza Bantustan, and the, you know, I think that's important. Also thinking about, you know, the context of the siege and the blockade of Gaza and the events that we're in the middle of today. One other, like, yeah, I think there's a couple of other things, but I'll maybe better stop there.
I think that's really clarifying, actually, and the idea that apartheid practices are parasitic on a colonial legal structure is really helpful. Daryl?
Yeah, sorry, I was passing the ball to John earlier because he's written so much and so importantly about the legal aspects of apartheid. I want to step back a little bit and think about apartheid in the context of political economy, and this builds quite a bit on what everyone else has said. And I apologize if this is just really obvious to everyone here, but I think one of the most important and basic differences between the apartheid system in the South African context and apartheid in Palestine is that in South Africa, apartheid was designed in many ways to facilitate the process of exploiting the labor of the native population, right? So we may recall that something like only 10% of the population of South Africa was white, and economy was based on, largely on extractive industries, some agriculture as well. So the control of native labor was absolutely critical, central to the apartheid regime there. In the case of Palestine, it's a bit different. Palestinian labor is important in some areas of the Israeli economy, but the extent of dependence on native labor is not what we saw in South Africa. And that has many implications for how the apartheid system is designed. So Nimer mentioned the Zionist logic of maximum, trying to secure control over maximum land with minimum Arabs. The converse of that is trying to pack the maximum number of Arabs onto the smallest possible piece of land. And of course, the Gaza Strip is one, very, very stark example of that. The Bantustan strategy that John mentioned, essentially in South Africa, the idea was if the colonizers are outnumbered 9-1, you want to divide the colonized population and fragment them into these little territorial enclaves. So that is certainly in evidence in the case of Palestine, but there is one very important difference in the Palestine Bantustans versus the South Africa Bantustans, which again comes down to the question of labor. Before the 1990s, people in Gaza, men in Gaza, overwhelmingly worked in the Israeli economy and would migrate back and forth, right? So the idea behind the Bantustans, whether we're talking about South Africa or we're talking about Gaza before the 1990s, was residential segregation, but labor mobility, right? So people could leave Gaza, they could go inside, they could work, and they would go back, right? Starting from the 1990s, Israel decided to reduce its dependence on the labor of Palestinians in Gaza, right? So it wasn't a Bantustan in the sense of a labor reserve, but it began to become more and more what people think of it today as, right? Like a open air prison, concentration camp, animal, all the different metaphors that people are aware of. The other thing that this forces us to confront, and I don't mean this to be alarmist because, of course, the current reality is horrible enough. But I think about an interview that the Palestinian thinker and strategist Tawfiq Haddad gave recently, where he talked about apartheid as essentially a temporary managerialist solution to the current balance of forces on the ground in Palestine. And a reminder that apartheid is essentially a stopgap measure, right? In the South African context, apartheid, I think, had a broader time horizon because of the need for exploiting native labor. In Palestine, apartheid is the best possible deal that Zionism can make out of the situation. But if the circumstances would radically change, then they don't necessarily need apartheid. They might do something else, something considerably more dramatic in terms of altering the demographic balance in the territory. And I think that's something that we have to be very mindful of in the current moment. Apartheid, if things go a certain way, might seem almost quaint in retrospect compared to the possibility of things that might be coming down the line.
Okay, well, that leads well into the next topic of discussion, which is again to consider both the the legal frameworks of ethnic cleansing and genocide that are being warned about by international law scholars and many others. And so I think I'd now like to invite our panelists to consider both the legal political frameworks of genocide and ethnic cleansing, but obviously with a frank discussion of what's occurring on the ground in not only in Gaza, but as you've brought up throughout this conversation with the escalating violence and killings of Palestinians that we're seeing in the West Bank, and also the escalating violence and tension in occupied East Jerusalem. I'm not sure who would like to speak first. Suhad, would you like to go first, or Nimer? I don't know.
Sure. So I'm going to say address one point, building on some of the points raised by Daryl in this conversation, without going into too much into the kind of legalities of it. So, I think John and Suhad probably are more capable in addressing the kind of more legal aspects. So I wanted just to comment on the Israeli theories of ethnic cleansing. And I think it's relevant to the question of the current moment. So as Daryl said, one of the main differences between the South African version of apartheid and the Zionist version of colonial apartheid is the exploitation of labor, extracting surplus value versus expulsion. So in the case of Zionism, instead of exploiting, they basically expelled and ethnically cleansed the population. And that's how they engineered as well the Jewish majority that manifests itself demographically under current conditions. So I don't want to go too much into kind of Zionist history, because we all know the different expressions of the kind of what Zionists call transfer or expulsion of the Palestinians. And the Palestinian historian Noor Masalha have written extensive books about this issue. I would like to talk only about the last 20 years or so of Israeli political culture. So what we have seen is that the right wing of Zionism, which was far right and then became gradually into the kind of mainstream and now in power in Israel, have always distinguished between three kinds of ethnic cleansing, or what they call transfer. So there's one called transfer during war, or forcible transfer. Two, transfer by agreement, by which they mean not the agreement of those who will be expelled, but rather kind of international agreement or agreement between states. And three, voluntary transfer, and by which they don't mean that, you immigrate on your own outside the country, but rather that we will make the conditions so bad for you that you will, and therefore we will encourage you to leave in this way. Now, what's important for this particular moment is to remember the first category. So all of the kind of right wing, so Rahbam Zevi in particular, and then after him, there was a political party called Moledit, led by Rabbi Benny Elon, was also a settler. And they were part of the government in the early 2000s. And now, of course, we have even a kind of a more extreme version of this, because as far as the right wing or the far right in Israel, the difference was between, initially at least, between forcible transfer, so that would be the Kahana and the Kach movement, and those who talked a little bit more kind of in a concealed manner about voluntary transfer. But with respect to transfer during war, transfer during conditions of, what they call existential war, they all agree. So obviously the paradigm for that is 1948. So if you look at the statements, and I tweeted about some of this stuff with quotes that are mostly in Hebrew by Benny Elon and others in interviews in 2001 and so on. So he was a minister in the government till I think 2004, Minister of Tourism. And then there is other kind of expressions that more recent on settlers' websites or kind of far-right websites that talk again about the idea of transfer during war, in which they say that if the conditions or the climate and the atmosphere that was created around 1948 of an existential war can be repeated, there will be an opportune historic moment in order to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible. And Ben Elon, in one of his interviews, said, whether this existential crisis is real or not real, that's something we will argue about later, after the fact. So what's important, he said, is the climate, creating the climate. And I think this, the whole talk, I mean, you know, it's imagine what's also going in terms of the international legal discussions now. It took one attack, I'm not minimizing the attack, but it took one attack in 6 decades in which the Palestinians inflicted significant Israeli casualties and civilian casualties for some of the the international legal scholars to invoke genocide. 6 decades or more of inflicting massive and asymmetrical and disproportionate killings on the Palestinians, including and mostly on the civilian population. And there were no serious discussions before now with respect to genocide. So I think we need to remember that now, when Israel is imposing particular conditions in Gaza, whether the evacuation orders, whether the removal of at least 1 million Palestinians from the northern part of Gaza, and all this talk about city of tents, and hopefully they will go to Sinai and the rest of it. I think all of them agree. And there, if you look at also the public opinion polls, which I used to collect in some of my early work, you will see that there has always been a significant part of the Israeli Jewish population, between 30 and 40%, which supported kind of different forms of transfer of the Palestinians, including Palestinians who are inside Israel. And obviously this support increases massively in moments of, you know, emotional hysteria and kind of all this talk about you know, existential crisis and a war of destruction and so on and so forth. And obviously the demonization of the Palestinians, and that there is no other solution than this solution.
Thank you. Suhad?
Yes. What we are seeing is in Gaza the past 2 weeks could potentially turn out into something defined as ethnic cleansing or forced disposition of transfer or displacement of transfer of people. And according to legal frameworks, deliberate military attacks or threats of attacks on civilian population and civilian area is considered coercive practices that is used to remove civilian population from one place to another geographic place, destruction of property, attacks on hospitals, medical personnel, and locations, and so on and so on. What we are seeing in Gaza. Now, it is important for me to mention that the crimes committed against Israeli civilians on the 10th of October does not justify the disproportionate and indiscriminate attacks through dehumanizing all of the Palestinians in Gaza to justify whatever is happening there. Now, those of you who followed the news, Sisi, the president of Egypt, said a few days ago that I will not accept the Palestinians in Egypt. If this happens, this might happen also to the Palestinians in the West Bank, that they might be deported or displaced to Jordan. And this is a bit worrying because I don't think this came out of the blue. It seems that there is some kind of international scenery that this might be the solution and this is extremely worrying in this regard. I mean, the scene of UNRWA tents that we are seeing in southern Gaza is really alarming and heart-breaking. Israel is trying to displace 1.1 million Gazans from the north of Gaza to the south, and no one really knows what will happen next. Like archival documents reveal, and I think some have written about this, that right after the occupation, there were quite detailed plans how to evict Gaza and how to displace and deport all of the Palestinians there. And we're talking about, it is estimated that 95% of the Palestinians in Gaza are refugees, as Nimer earlier mentioned. So keep that in mind when we speak about the logic of deportation and displacement in this sense. And the disengagement plan came in the mid-2000s, which created a huge public discourse and legal discourse in Israel, which was never settled down in a way that lives in peace with the disengagement in any manner, politically and legally. And there were some Supreme Court justices that were against that disengagement and still plan. And it seems that there are some who estimate that this is the time of the extreme right wing that controls the government and the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. And they might take advantage of the situation to implement their vision of Gaza as an integral part of the land for the Jewish people. Now, these are estimations. We haven't seen any actual plans, but everyone should be alerted in this regard, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. For John and Daryl, I want to shift the focus of this question a little bit, because in fact, even, as lawyers, we know all of the contradictions of using and dealing with colonial legal systems. The international legal system originates with in the late 15th century, really, with European colonialism, etc. I suppose the question I would like you to respond to is, when we're thinking about when we're watching unfold before our eyes, actually, forced population transfer, ethnic cleansing, all of these things that are patently illegal under international humanitarian law, etc. Can you just reflect a little bit on the level of impunity that Israel seems to enjoy when it comes to Europe and Canadian American governments, as well as other states?
Will I go, Daryl? Do you want to go? Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I suppose one answer is that, it's always been that way, and international law is an imperial tool, and we should never have any expectations about it being different. But at the same time, I do think there is something, it's certainly in Europe at the moment anyway, it feels there is something qualitatively different about the response that has come from most of the Western leaders, at least from where I'm looking at it from. And so I think we have to think about why that is. And so there's a couple of things I'd say around this, and I think it goes back, partly, we can think back to the discussion about ethnic cleansing and genocide, and what Nimer said, particularly around that idea of the opportunity in when the crisis moment arrives, the opportunity being taken from an Israeli strategic side. There's also just a question or a point, I think, to emphasize just about the dynamics in the world today, where, you know, the whatever pretense about liberal internationalism and the rules-based order that might have been there, you know, in recent years, you know, in some shape or form, you know, despite everything that we saw with Iraq and the war on terror and so on, some of the, you know, respectability rhetoric around that has, you know, I think really slipped away, and the mask is gone altogether in some. It becomes possible context then for genocidal type escalations to happen, and not to, you know, and for them to essentially be given the green light in a way that they mightn't have been, you know, previously. And so one part of that is to do with just, you know, the kind of trajectory in military thinking in places like Israel and other imperial contexts. Again, you know, the from the time of the Second Intifada and the war on terror, the dynamics of this are important, and, you know, the way that the distinction between civilian and combatant gets, you know, at least rhetorically kind of progressively eroded in a way that it becomes possible to justify killing larger and larger numbers of people as collateral damage. And people probably saw the American general who was on at some point very early in this escalation in Gaza, talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza as collateral damage. And, you know, that's kind of seemed to be, you know, people kind of seem to think that was a normal thing to say. And so you have this situation where, you know, because of the way that Israeli leaders, for example, have been able to talk about you know, the entire Gaza Strip as an enemy entity, and they've done that, you know, that's been categorized in Israeli policy since 2007, that Gaza is a hostile entity or an enemy entity as a whole, right? That there's, you know, it's not just about one particular militant group or one particular political faction. It's the Gaza Strip as a whole is an enemy entity. And so, you know, it becomes possible then to when you know, when you're treating the territory and the population as such, it becomes possible to turn genocidal in that sense. And you have, you know, a configuration or a coalescence in the kind of global geopolitical context, where you have this embrace by the capitalist powers and the Western powers of neo-fascist leaders in various parts of the world, and, you know, Modi in India being an obvious example, but there's others as well. And you know, the idea that the pogroms and the massacres and atrocities that have been carried out in other parts of the world are normalized. It creates this kind of configuration where you have this alliance, but, you know, you have this alliance among the mainstream establishment powers in the West with these very far-right neo-fascist regimes in other parts of the world. And so, you know, this kind of level of you know, of violence on a scale and severity in Gaza that we haven't seen before is, you know, has been mostly accepted. And it's gone way, it's not just the, you know, in Ireland, the dynamic is slightly different, and we're kind of given out because our leaders are doing the kind of both sides scenario and the false equivalences. But, you know, that compared to the rest of Europe, or most of the rest of Europe anyway, that's, you know, that's way more, you know, that's a way higher bar than the response and the interactions we have elsewhere, where it's essentially, you know, absolute support for not just Israel's right to defend itself, but Israel's right to defend itself in whatever manner it sees fit. And there's no, you know, there's no limitations on that at all up to this point. And so, you know, there is I think, you know, a serious implications then for what does that mean for what international law is and what purpose it can serve. And then there's, you know, then there are tactical and strategic questions then for Palestinian movements to think about. To what extent do you engage with these institutions? How do you engage with them? And I think going back to Nimer's point about you know, the genocide analysis, and why one of the reasons I think why it hasn't been discussed as extensively or as widely as it could have been in the last 75 years in relation to attacks on Palestinians is partly, I think, because there was a reluctance or a hesitance among Palestinian activists and lawyers and legal organizations to talk about genocide, because not necessarily because they didn't think there was analysis or a legal argument that could be made, but more so because tactically they felt it was better to focus on some of the structural elements to do with apartheid, occupation, colonialism, whatever it was at a certain point. But I think what's really, what's been very clear in this escalation from the very start, the rhetoric, the severity and scale of the dehumanizing language and how widespread it was. Like if we think about 2014 and the war on Gaza, then you had some examples here and there of, the justice minister at the time shared a Facebook post that someone else had written, and there was a bit of discussion about incitement to genocide and so on. But now it's, the prime minister, the defense minister, senior generals who are using this language that's very typically associated with genocidal incitement and intent to do with categorizing the people as subhuman or human animals, and all the rest of it that we've heard. That was very clear from the start. The extent of the force that's been used has been way above and beyond what we've had previously. And so from the start, a lot of Palestinian and solidarity activists were talking about genocide in a way that I think they hadn't before. And so then, that makes it incumbent then on us as international lawyers and legal scholars and people intervening in these debates to take that seriously and to think about what the contribution is. And so, you've had this big kind of mobilization and set of discussions then around the nature of genocidal intent. What can we see unfolding? And you had to the point that it's gone within the space of a few days to from it being NGOs to genocide and Holocaust studies scholars to big American organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights and so on, and now a set of UN special rapporteurs yesterday talking about genocide and all of this, sounding the alarm and so on. And that, I think does create it's creating a challenge for the international legal system as to how it's going to respond. But there's, I think you can see there's such a massive disconnect between that legal analysis and the rhetoric and the engagements of political leaders that there's there's a huge gap that needs to be thought through there. So I'll maybe just hand it over to Daryl on that.
Thanks. Yeah, Daryl, after Daryl comments, there's one question that's come through from the audience that I think would be a good one to wrap up with. So Daryl, go ahead, and then I'll pose the question.
Thank you, Brenna, and thank you, John. Everything you said sets up exactly what I was thinking of saying. I think I'm the only person on the panel who lives in the United States. So I think everyone here is probably aware of the wall-to-wall and unconditional support that the United States government affords to Israel's crimes, the billions of dollars of aid, the protection in the UN, all these things. I don't need to, belabor it. I would like to focus on something that has really come to light, which is the nature of genocide and mass atrocity discourse. So part of the issue here is that the Genocide Convention as a legal document is, in my opinion, kind of drafted in a way so as to make it extremely difficult to use, like very, very complicated, weird distinctions around intent that are almost designed to set up like very, nearly irresolvable conundrums over definitions and so on, in a way that really kind of expands the political discretion over how the word is used and the gatekeeping around genocide. By which I mean, I think in the past 30 or 40 years in the United States, the Zionist movement has very successfully gate-kept the idea of genocide in general, right? So Israel, of course, is the state of the Jewish people. The Jewish people suffered the paradigmatic case of genocide, namely the Holocaust, and therefore they have a unique authority over arbitrating what are the correct and incorrect usages of the word. And this manifests through things like the academic field of genocide studies, through public institutions like the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, journalists. There's been this disciplining function where anywhere around the world, if you want to use the word genocide and not be dismissed as hysterical, shrill, or crank, you have to basically be in alignment with US interests and with the gatekeepers around this term genocide. This has reverberations for politics in the Balkans and Central Africa. I mean, even at the level of like the grammar of commemoration. I visited a genocide memorial in Nyamata, which is in Rwanda, like maybe half an hour from the capital. And in the memorial, there's a room that has a pile of shoes in it, right? Which is a trope from Holocaust museums like Auschwitz that, of course, connects to the way that people had to disrobe systematically as they were being dehumanized in the Nazi concentration camps. But in the Rwandan context, it doesn't make any sense as a trope, right? So like the Holocaust is so influential in how mass atrocity is imagined and debated in many places around the world, right? And of course, when we think about how mass atrocity and genocide are invoked in US foreign policy, right? Like, okay, is there a genocide or not, is a way that triggers certain policy outcomes, whether we're talking about Darfur, Xinjiang, like all of these different cases, right? Now, what's happening in the United States now is that there is this use that it's finally become, I don't want to say acceptable or permissible, but there's greater and greater usage of the term genocide in connection with Israeli actions. And that is, that's definitely a new thing. I have not seen that in my lifetime. And it is symptomatic of a generational schism in the American Jewish community, right? A younger generation that has actually taken all of the lessons of Holocaust education, never again, and so on, and is actually trying to enact it in a way that, of course, is completely against the intentions of the elders, right? So this ideological suffocating in the United States, in elite institutions and in public life, what Umayya Cable calls compulsory Zionism. I call it boomer Zionism because I think it has a very specific kind of like late 20th century temporality to it. The generation of the boomer Zionists are having a reckoning with their grandchildren, right? And this word genocide is kind of a fulcrum where this is unfolding. And a key reason why this intergenerational conversation is happening is, I think, the emergence of the movement for Black Lives in the United States. In the past 20 years, I think Black Lives Matter is probably the single most transformative factor for organizing and advocating for Palestine, for Palestinian liberation in the United States. And I think when it comes to the specific case of the younger generation of Ashkenazim in the United States, Black Lives Matter kind of forced them to confront their whiteness in the US context, but also for some of them, confront the privileges that are conferred to them as people recognized as Jews under the Zionist regime in Israel as well. This will be enough to actually change things is, of course, a totally different issue, but it is a development that I think is very interesting and worth following.
That's extremely helpful in understanding the current sort of political situation around this, particularly in the US. So I wanted to finish off. I know we're running a little bit over time, but I want to finish off with a question. There's many questions in the that people have emailed in, and some of them have been answered in the course of our discussion. And I can say that some of them actually raise the idea of maybe sort of sharing more widely all of the resources that different organizations have been putting out, so people can gain a basic education. But in Vancouver, just bringing it back to where I am situated, there's been a really amazing eruption of young Palestinian organizing and activism, as well as different groups of people working in solidarity with the Palestine youth movement here. I'm not, now the questions are anonymized, but this does seem to me to be a question that is coming from someone here, given our reconciliation and decolonization conflictual politics as well. So the question is, and we'll wrap up with this, is what role do the demands for ceasefire play in our direct action in the context of refusing any outcome other than decolonization, land back, and Palestinian sovereignty? The discourse is getting confusing, and it's difficult to discern what to call for in the midst of liberal domestication and co-optation, which to me, I could be wrong, but it feels like it's coming from one of our, younger comrades organizing to end the occupation and apartheid regime. So if you could please just spend a few minutes reflecting on that would be really helpful. Do I need to repeat the question, or it was, I'll just repeat the question one more time. What role do the demands for ceasefire play in our direct action in the context of refusing any outcome other than decolonization, land back, and Palestinian sovereignty? So really a question about direct action in this moment and organizing. Suhad, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, very. The Palestinian issue is not a humanitarian, sure. Not undermining, of course, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, but resolving humanitarian issue will not resolve the Palestinian as much as it is important, does not resolve the Palestinian issue. This needs to be dealt through a decolonization process for sure. And I think what characterizes the discussion in the past, since the beginning of October, the first week of October, is that you don't hear any context. No context, no occupation, no blockade on Gaza, nothing. Just humanitarian crisis, in best case scenario, disproportionate reaction, and so on and so on. But total absence of context. And I think, I hope that after all of this crisis is over, that the ICJ will advance with its advisory opinion, and it will contribute to shifting the discussion, also internationally, to the core issue and the root causes, and how to decolonize and guarantee the Palestinian people their right to self-determination and no less. It seems that it's lost under the circumstances, but everyone has to make their share in bringing these core issues to the core international discussion going ahead. And I hope the ICJ advisory opinion will have its contribution in this regard.
Thank you. Nimer?
So if I understood the question correctly, it invokes the idea that there is a tension between demanding ceasefire and then the kind of longer-term goal of decolonization. I don't think so. I mean, the demand for ceasefire is a demand for saving lives now. And if the ceasefire means stopping the evacuation or the expulsion of 1 million Palestinians, then obviously that would be a worthwhile goal. The difference, I think, between kind of a liberal or a human rights agenda versus an anti-colonial agenda becomes whether you stop there or do you continue connecting this question and the repetitive or the structural aspect of it that keeps repeating, these kind of proliferating symptoms of the root causes that Suhad was talking about. So the question is, do we have an anti-colonial analysis? Do we have an anti-colonial agenda? And the ceasefire will be only kind of the immediate and not necessarily the end goal of the kind of a decolonization agenda. Because eventually, I think the question of Palestine is not necessarily an exception to an otherwise, well-ordered and well-functioning international legal system, as John and Daryl and all the panel has mentioned in different ways. And the fact that, for example, the US can shield Israel from accountability, from the application of the kind of basic demands of international law is not an aberration. It's not even a violation of the decision-making structures of the UN and the international legal system. It is the legal system, this international structure that allows this kind of situation to arise and empowers the US and other countries to be in this position. So I think what sometimes is absent in the analysis, specifically in human rights kind of discourse, is all these appeals to the international community. And obviously all these appeals are kind of in a way disappointing and depressing because the international community is not able to act. But the international community is such an ill-defined kind of concept. And what's missing from the analysis is the concept of imperialism, that there are imperial actors, such as the US, and we need an analysis how this kind of larger framework of imperialism repeats itself in different instances. Obviously, the question of Palestine is not the only situation in which of impunity and lack of accountability. There was a report a couple of years ago about Yemen by UN experts in which they talked about the epidemic of impunity or lack of accountability. So there are different instances of that in which the weak, the colonized, the occupied, the excluded, the impoverished are, at the sharp end of kind of political arrangements. And there is a need to kind of analyze this long-standing issue of lack of accountability with respect to Palestine in particular. So Palestine is a litmus test for the international legal system. And the fact that it has been kind of a long-standing challenge to the idea of the kind of international legal system is an invitation to kind of an anti-colonial agenda that is tied also to an anti-imperial agenda. So in order to be able to overcome the international structures of power that do not even allow the enforcement or the implementation of the basic promises of a liberal order. I keep going back to the story of the Athenian invasion of Melos around 400 BC, in which the Athenians basically told the millions, basically Athens was the equivalent of an empire today. And it was obviously an asymmetrical encounter. And they offered the millions either, to be killed or to become slaves. And the millions answered that they have, Athenians, you can't do that because we have rights. And the Athenians famously or infamously replied, rights are in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. The idea of international law was supposed to be an answer to this Athenian kind of challenge in order to somewhat to level the playing field between the weak and the strong. But obviously, we have seen repeatedly that the strong have been in many ways able to use these international rules or violate them, if you want, in ways that allows them to dominate. So I think we need to start from, the basic demand for ceasefire to save as much as civilian lives as possible at this moment, to stop the, expulsion of the Palestinians from Gaza, or at least the north of Gaza, and then continue with the tying this particular instance of the, call it crisis or onslaught, to the larger issues that we have been discussing in this webinar, in order to reach the root cause and then address the root causes in order to allow a situation in which Palestinians, like everyone else, can live in freedom, equality, and dignity.
Right. Thank you so much. And just with our first two responses, I think making it very clear how decolonization is both, it involves this huge range and panoply of tactics and strategies, right? Which are both involving direct action on the ground, as well as some of the legal mechanisms that Suhad referred to. Daryl and John, shall we go? John, would you like to go next? And then Daryl can have his final comments.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again, Brenna. So, yeah, I just added. So I think I'd agree with that, and just add maybe a couple of short notes. But like I think, yeah, the demand for the ceasefire is a minimum demand, an immediate demand. I think, you know, it's the focus for now, but that doesn't in any way detract from or go against the longer term bigger demands. And I think like given the risk and the specter of, you know, that level of potentially an eliminatory or annihilatory violence that Daryl kind of alluded to earlier, like having a ceasefire as a possibility, as a realistic thing that can be struggled for, I think, you know, it is, you know, a really essential thing. You know, just given what we're seeing, like with the US veto at the Security Council for, you know, because they objected to the idea of humanitarian pauses or whatever the phrase was in the resolution. In some of the European Union statements, like Ireland and some of the smaller peripheral countries in Europe have asked at certain points for, like, after all of the stuff about Israel's right to defend itself, etc., just for like phrases like a call for de-escalation to be included, and that has been overruled and left out. And so, you know, so far the level of kind of green light that has been there for the onslaught is, you know, is really dangerous. And so putting a stop to that, I think, by you know, whatever variety of tactics possible is essential. And I like you know, partly in response to the EU's position, there was, just as one example, like one of our groups in Dublin occupied the European Commission offices yesterday, and, you know, they had a list of 6 or 7 demands. The first one was call for an immediate ceasefire, but then there was, you know, the follow-on ones then about sanctions and about ending the occupation and the bigger, longer term aims. And I think, you know, whatever happens in the current configuration, and I think, you know, I think and hope at some point the absolute level of carte blanche that has been there for Israel will start to slip, and there will be a bit of a dissipation of the support, at least in its kind of how comprehensive and universal it's been. The more the atrocities continue. The other, you know, the very obvious thing that's clear is the generational schisms within Jewish communities, but also just within the general population that Daryl mentioned, and the gap that's there between, you know, the popular understandings of the situation and the decisions that are being made by people in power. And, you know, and maybe it's just they're not showing up in my news feeds, but like you know, the mass demonstrations that have been there for in solidarity with Palestinians, you know, there's no equivalent or nothing comparable at all in terms of rallies in support of the Israeli position. And so, you know, there is, you know, that is something to work with. And whatever happens in this in this sequence of events in Gaza, things are, you know, it is of such magnitude that things are not going to go back. And I think the demands have to be about ceasefire as that minimum initial thing, but it's not just a return to the suffocating siege and blockade and the 200 people shot at the border fence when they go on a march of return, or the dozens of people killed every month in the West Bank, that level of structural violence and ongoing violence can't be allowed to continue as the status quo. And I think the reality is that things will be different after this in many ways. And so that's what the role of all of our movements is, to build on that as best possible. But obviously, avoiding the worst case scenarios in the short term is essential. And I think, just on a final point on this, and I think where you can see some of these tensions in the European context, and the reason why the support for Israel has been so absolute, is that there is a lot of what's happened in European politics in recent years has been about really revolving around the border paranoia and some of the exaggerated versions of great replacement theories and white genocide myths. For a lot of the European establishment, they see Israel in some sense as a kind of a microcosm of Fortress Europe, and that's why they've been so absolute in their support when it comes to this infiltration of the fence or the border. And so I think the political sphere in the European context is breaking down along those lines, and there are I think important alliances between anti-racist movements, imperial movements, and the Palestine solidarity context that I think can only be stronger as things go on. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Daryl, and just thanks again to everyone for the organizing and for being here.
Thanks, John. Daryl?
Thanks. Yeah, this will be a little bit underwhelming. I agree with everything that's been said. I appreciate the spirit behind the question in terms of interrogating what the demands are. And I think we also have to interrogate who is making demands and where are those demands being made. And especially the distinction between Palestinian national formations and solidarity formations, although, of course, there are people who might see themselves as situated in both. And the challenge here is that for those of us who are engaged in solidarity work, and even for those in the national liberation movement, we're operating in a context of fragmentation and sometimes, I wouldn't say strategic incoherence, but strategic difficulty, right? It's not like, there's a central office from a national liberation movement that kind of issues marching orders and talking points and everyone kind of gets in line, right? Like, it's actually much more difficult. It's much more cacophonous than that. And of course, people are situated in different places with different constraints, and all of the local sort of political dynamics that John in particular highlighted are so important. So I guess my response to that question is to invite more and more contextualized and textured engagements in how people are engaging in political work from whatever location they may be, and with whatever subject position they might find themselves in.
That's a great note to wrap up on. And in that spirit, I'll say that we are planning more Decolonise Palestine teach-ins. And the recording of this event will be posted on the CCMS website that's hosted at SFU, and also the Social Justice Center website at KPU. Those are all on the poster for the event. And I really want to give my heartfelt thank you to all of our speakers, and recognizing the extreme pressure under which people are working and operating right now, particularly Suhad and Nimer. And I can't thank you enough for taking the time out for this. Really, thank you very, very much. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in. We had well over 300 people and more trying to enter the room. So there's clearly appetite for education and discussion. So thank you very much. And with that, we will we'll end this session. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Brenna.
Thank you, Brenna.
Thank you.
Thanks.